Margaret Hawthorne pressed her face against the cold window of the general store, watching the townspeople of Cedar Falls go about their daily lives. At 26, she had grown accustomed to the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, how mothers pulled their children closer, and how potential suitors suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. Her father's words from that morning still echoed in her mind. "Face the truth, Margaret. You're too ugly to marry. No decent man will ever want you." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But across the dusty main street, a tall stranger in worn leather boots was watching her through that same window, and something in his weathered face suggested her father might be wrong. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hawthorn farmstead as Margaret carefully arranged wildflowers in a mason jar. Her calloused hands, roughened by years of hard work, trembled slightly as she positioned each bloom. Today was her younger sister Clara's wedding day, and despite the hollow ache in her chest, Margaret was determined to make everything perfect. "Margaret!" Her father's voice boomed from the kitchen, sharp with irritation. "Stop fussing with those weeds and help your mother with the preparations." Thomas Hawthorne was a man carved from prairie stone, hard, unyielding, and weathered by decades of farming the unforgiving Kansas soil. His words carried the weight of absolute authority, and Margaret had learned long ago not to question them. She set down the flowers and smoothed her simple brown dress, the same one she wore to church every Sunday, and to every rare social gathering she was permitted to attend. The Hawthorne house buzzed with activity as neighbors arrived to help prepare for Clara's afternoon ceremony. Women clustered around the kitchen table, their voices creating a warm hum of conversation that somehow excluded Margaret entirely. She moved among them like a ghost, fetching water, carrying plates, completing tasks that kept her hands busy. But her presence nearly invisible. Clara stood in the center of the front parlor, radiant in their grandmother's wedding dress. The ivory silk, carefully preserved for decades, transformed her into something ethereal. Her golden hair caught the morning light streaming through the lace curtains, and her blue eyes sparkled with joy and anticipation. At 19, Clara possessed the kind of beauty that made grown men stumble over their words and teenage boys carve her initials into barn doors. "Oh, Clara, you look absolutely divine," cooed Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, as she adjusted the dress's delicate sleeves. "Jonathan is the luckiest man in all of Kansas." Margaret hung back near the doorway, watching her sister's happiness, with a mixture of genuine love and deep, private sorrow. She had spent countless evenings helping Clara practice her wedding vows, teaching her the recipes their grandmother had passed down, and listening to her sister's excited chatter about married life. Never once had Margaret allowed her own longing to show. "Margaret, come help me with this veil," Clara called, her voice bright with affection. Despite everything, the sisters shared a genuine bond. Clara had never been cruel about her beauty or Margaret's lack thereof. That cruelty came from other sources. As Margaret approached, her father stepped into the parlor. Thomas Hawthorne's weathered face broke into a rare smile as he looked at his younger daughter. "My beautiful Clara," he said, his voice unusually soft, "you'll make the finest wife Jonathan could ask for." His gaze shifted to Margaret, and the warmth evaporated instantly. "Margaret, your face will sour the milk. Try to keep to the back during the ceremony. We don't want to give the guests the wrong impression." The words hit like physical blows, but Margaret simply nodded and continued adjusting Clara's veil. She had heard variations of this sentiment her entire life, from her father, from schoolmates, from well-meaning relatives who spoke in whispers they thought she couldn't hear. The message was always the same: she was a burden and embarrassment, something to be hidden away. Mrs. Patterson's uncomfortable silence filled the room. Even Clara's joy dimmed for a moment as she reached for Margaret's hand, squeezing it gently. But Thomas Hawthorne was already moving on, barking orders about seating arrangements and refreshment tables, his daughter's wounded expression dismissed. As easily as morning frost, Margaret retreated to the kitchen, where she found her mother, Ellen, bent over a massive pot of stew. Ellen Hawthorne was a woman worn thin by prairie life and her husband's harsh temperament. Once she might have possessed her own quiet beauty, but years of childbearing, endless work, and emotional isolation had carved deep lines around her eyes and mouth. "Mama, do you need help?" Margaret asked quietly. Ellen looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "The bread needs to come out of the oven. Mind it doesn't burn." They worked in silence, two women bound by shared understanding of their place. In Thomas Hawthorne's world, Ellen had learned long ago that defending her elder daughter only brought her husband's wrath down on both of them. Love in the Hawthorne household was a luxury they couldn't afford. As Margaret pulled golden loaves from the wood-fired oven, she heard horses approaching outside. Through the kitchen window, she could see Jonathan Whitmore arriving with his family for the ceremony. Jonathan was everything a woman could want in a husband: handsome, prosperous, kind, and genuinely smitten with Clara. His father owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, and Jonathan himself had built a reputation as a fair and hard-working man. But trailing behind the Whitmore family wagon was another rider, someone Margaret didn't recognize. The stranger sat tall in his saddle, his broad shoulders filling out a clean but well-worn shirt. His hat was pulled low, casting shadows across his face, but something about his posture suggested quiet confidence rather than arrogance. "Who's that riding with the Whitmores?" Margaret asked her mother. Ellen glanced out the window, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Must be Daniel Morrison. I heard Jonathan's cousin came up from Texas to help manage the new ranch property. Been working cattle drives down south." Margaret watched as the stranger dismounted, his movements fluid and economical. When he removed his hat to smooth back dark hair, she caught a glimpse of his profile's strong jaw, weathered skin that spoke of countless hours under the open sky, and something in his bearing that suggested he was a man comfortable with solitude. "Margaret!" Her father's voice cracked like a whip. "Stop gawking and help seat the guests. And remember what I told you about staying in the background." The ceremony took place under a canopy of elm trees behind the house, with Clara and Jonathan exchanging vows before the traveling preacher who served their rural community. Margaret positioned herself near the back, as instructed, helping to serve refreshments and ensure everything ran smoothly. She moved efficiently between tasks, practically invisible to the celebrating guests, but as she carried a pitcher of fresh lemonade toward the refreshment table, she became aware of eyes watching her. The stranger Daniel Morrison stood slightly apart from the other guests, his gaze following her movements with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. Margaret had grown expert at recognizing different types of stares. There was the quick, dismissive glance that cataloged her plainness and moved on. There was the uncomfortable scrutiny that seemed to inventory every flaw. And there was the cruel assessment that lingered just long enough to find amusement in her appearance. But Daniel Morrison's attention felt different: steady, thoughtful, almost curious. When their eyes met briefly across the crowd, he didn't look away in embarrassment or disgust. Instead, he touched the brim of his hat in a small gesture of acknowledgement that sent unexpected warmth spreading through her chest. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret noticed Daniel helping elderly guests to their seats, quietly assisting with heavy lifting, and speaking with genuine interest to farmers and shopkeepers alike. He possessed an easy way with people that suggested confidence without condescension, a rare quality in men of his obvious prosperity. During the dancing that followed dinner, Margaret busied herself cleaning plates and organizing the kitchen. Through the open door, she could hear the fiddle music and laughter, the sound of her community celebrating. Clara's joy was infectious, and even Thomas Hawthorne had loosened his stern demeanor enough to dance with his new daughter-in-law. "Mighty," Fine celebration, a voice said behind her. Margaret turned to find Daniel Morrison standing in the kitchen doorway, hat in hand. Up close, she could see that her first assessment had been accurate. He was indeed handsome, but in a weathered, practical way that spoke of honest work rather than idle vanity. His eyes were the color of sage grass, and they regarded her with the same thoughtful attention she had noticed earlier. "Yes, sir," she replied quietly, suddenly aware of her flour-stained apron and the wisps of hair that had escaped her careful bun. "Clara makes a beautiful bride." "She does indeed," Daniel agreed, stepping into the kitchen. "But I was thinking more about all the work that goes into making such a day special. Seems like you've been keeping everything running smooth as silk." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Compliments were so foreign to her experience that she hardly knew how to respond. "Just doing what needs doing," Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "That's a fine quality in a person. My grandmother always said you could judge character by watching how someone handles the work nobody notices." Before Margaret could formulate a response, her father's voice cut through the evening air. "Margaret, where are you? These dishes won't wash themselves." The spell was broken. Margaret ducked her head and moved toward the door, but Daniel's voice stopped her. "Miss Hawthorne?" She turned back, surprised he knew her name. "Would it be proper if I called on you sometime? Maybe took you for a ride around the countryside?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The words hit Margaret like a physical shock. She stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. Men didn't ask to call on her. Men didn't seek her company for pleasure rides. The very idea was so foreign that she wondered if this was some elaborate joke. I don't think ... She began, but her father's approaching footsteps ended the conversation. Thomas Hawthorne appeared in the doorway, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. "Morrison, isn't it? I hope my daughter hasn't been bothering you with her chatter." "Not at all, sir," Daniel replied evenly. "I was just complimenting her on the fine job she's done with the celebration preparations." Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly. "Margaret has her uses, I suppose. But she's got work to finish. Margaret, get to those dishes." As Margaret hurried past her father, she caught Daniel's expression in her peripheral vision. The easy friendliness had been replaced by something harder, more calculating. He was studying Thomas Hawthorne with the same intensity he had earlier directed at her, but now there was a coolness in his gaze that suggested he was forming opinions about more than just kitchen efficiency. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of cleaning and organizing. Margaret worked mechanically, her mind replaying the brief conversation with Daniel Morrison. Had he really asked to call on her? The very possibility seemed too fragile to examine closely, too precious to risk breaking with too much hope. As the last guests departed and Clara and Jonathan left for their new home, Margaret found herself alone in the kitchen with the final load of dishes. Her parents had retired, exhausted by the day's festivities and no doubt relieved that their social obligations had been fulfilled without embarrassment. Through the window, she could see the moon rising over the prairie, casting silver light across the endless grassland. Somewhere out there, Daniel Morrison was riding back to the Whitmore Ranch, and Margaret couldn't help wondering if he was thinking about their conversation or if it had already faded from his memory, like so many casual exchanges. She dried the last plate and hung up her apron, her body aching from the long day's labor. As she prepared to blow out the kitchen lamp, she noticed something on the windowsill, a single wildflower, the same variety she had been arranging that morning. Someone had placed it there while she worked, a small gesture that no one else would have noticed or understood. Margaret picked up the flower, twirling its stem between her fingers. In a day full of joy and celebration, this tiny token felt like the most precious gift of all. For the first time in her adult life, someone had noticed her not as a burden or an embarrassment, but as a person worthy of a small kindness. She pressed The flower between the pages of her mother's old recipe book, where it would be safe from her father's dismissive gaze and her own tendency to doubt good things. Tomorrow would bring its usual challenges and disappointments. But tonight, Margaret Hawthorne allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, her father might be wrong about her future. 3 weeks after Clara's wedding, Margaret stood at the edge of Miller's Creek, her bare feet submerged in the cool water as she scrubbed the family's laundry against the smooth stones. The September air carried hints of autumn's approach, and the cottonwood trees had begun their slow transformation from green to gold. She had risen before dawn to complete this chore, knowing her father would expect the washing finished before the morning milking. The solitude brought her peace. Here, with only the creek's gentle murmur and the distant call of meadowlarks for company, she could let her guard down. No critical eyes examined her every movement. No harsh words reminded her of her failings. She could simply exist without apology. A horse's whinny broke the morning quiet. Margaret looked up to see a familiar figure approaching along the creek path, Daniel Morrison, mounted on a sturdy bay gelding. Her heart performed an unexpected leap, followed immediately by a wave of self-consciousness. She was dressed in her oldest work dress, her hair braided simply for practicality, and her hands were red from the creek's chill. "Good morning, Miss Hawthorne," Daniel called as he dismounted. "Hope I'm not disturbing your work." "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," she replied, wringing out one of her father's shirts with perhaps more force than necessary. "Just finishing up the washing." Daniel led his horse to the creek's edge to drink, his movements unhurried and natural. "Beautiful morning for it. I was riding the fence line between our property and the Hendersons' place. Spotted you from the ridge and thought I'd stop to say hello." Margaret nodded politely, acutely aware of how she must appear, a spinster doing laundry at the creek like countless women before her. Yet Daniel's presence didn't feel intrusive or patronizing. He settled onto a fallen log nearby, apparently content to watch the creek flow past while his horse drank. "Then meaning to ask," he said after a comfortable silence, "how's your sister settling into married life?" "Clara's happy," Margaret replied, genuine warmth entering her voice. "Jonathan built her a beautiful little house on the south pasture. She came by yesterday to show me the curtains she's been sewing. Says she feels like she's playing house, except it's real." Daniel chuckled. "Jonathan's been walking around like he swallowed sunshine ever since the wedding. Keeps asking my advice about everything from roof repairs to what flowers to plant in the spring. I told him he married himself a capable woman who probably knows more about running a household than I do about managing cattle." The comment struck Margaret as both generous and perceptive. Too many men viewed their wives as decorative additions to their lives rather than true partners. "You seem to have a high opinion of women's capabilities, Mr. Morrison." "My mother ran our ranch for 3 years after my father died, until I was old enough to take over," Daniel explained. "She kept the books, managed the hands, made decisions about breeding stock and grazing rotation. Taught me that intelligence and strength come in many forms, and gender isn't much of an indicator of either." Margaret paused in her scrubbing, studying his profile as he watched a red-winged blackbird perch on a cattail. Most men she knew spoke of women as creatures to be protected and guided, not as equals capable of complex thought and decisive action. Her father certainly subscribed to that philosophy, though he applied it selectively, expecting her to work like a field hand while treating her opinions as worthless chatter. "That must have been difficult," she said carefully, "losing your father so young." "It was, but it taught me to value people for what they contribute, rather than what others expect them to be." Daniel's eyes met hers directly. "Speaking of which, I was serious about that ride I mentioned at the wedding. If you'd be interested in seeing some of the countryside, I know some beautiful spots most folks never visit." Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks. The invitation hung between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate the kindness, But I should tell you my father has strong opinions about such things. He doesn't encourage social calls. What about your opinions? Daniel asked quietly. Do you have those? The question caught her off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked what she wanted, what she thought, what she preferred? Margaret felt a flutter of something between excitement and terror. Yes, I suppose I do. Then maybe we could find a way to honor both your father's concerns and your own wishes. I could speak with him directly and explain that my intentions are honorable. Or perhaps we could arrange something more public, a church social or community gathering where proper supervision would be obvious. Margaret's practical mind immediately began cataloging obstacles. Her father's reaction would be explosive. The gossip would be merciless. People would wonder what possible interest a successful rancher could have in Thomas Hawthorne's plain daughter. The speculation alone would make life unbearable. But another part of her, part she had kept carefully buried for years, whispered that perhaps those concerns mattered less than the opportunity to spend time with someone who looked at her without judgment, who spoke to her as if her thoughts had value. There's a harvest dance next Saturday, she heard herself saying. At the Grange Hall, most of the county will be there. Daniel's face lit up with genuine pleasure. Would you allow me to escort you? The commitment felt enormous, terrifying, and thrilling all at once. I'd like that, Margaret said softly. Then it's settled. Daniel stood and gathered his horse's reins. I'll call on your family Friday evening to make the arrangements proper like with your father. As he prepared to mount, Margaret felt compelled to offer a warning. Mr. Morrison... Daniel. You should know that my father can be... difficult. He has particular ideas about my prospects, and they don't include gentlemen callers. Daniel paused, one foot in the stirrup. Miss Margaret, I've dealt with difficult men before. I've negotiated cattle prices with rustlers, convinced bank officers to extend credit during drought years, and talked my way out of more than one bar fight in Dodge City. I think I can handle a conversation with your father. There was confidence in his voice, but not arrogance. Margaret found herself believing he meant what he said. He'll want to know your intentions. Then I'll tell him the truth, Daniel replied, swinging into the saddle. That I find his daughter interesting, intelligent, and deserving of respectful attention. That I'd like the opportunity to know her better, with his permission and blessing. After he rode away, Margaret remained by the creek long after the laundry was finished. She tried to imagine her father's reaction to Daniel's request, and none of the scenarios ended well. Thomas Hawthorne's pride was bound up in his ability to control his family completely. The idea that someone might value Margaret enough to court her would challenge his fundamental beliefs about her worth and his authority. But for the first time in her adult life, Margaret felt a spark of rebellion. She was 26 years old, capable of running a household, managing complex tasks, and making sound decisions. Why should her father's cruel assessment of her worth determine her entire future? That evening at supper, Thomas dominated the conversation, with complaints about crop prices and weather patterns. Ellen listened with practiced patience while Margaret served the meal she had spent the afternoon preparing. The routine was so familiar it felt like a script they had been performing for years. Saw Morrison riding near Miller's Creek this morning, Thomas mentioned casually as he buttered his bread. Wonder what brings him to that part of the county. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she poured his coffee, but she kept her voice steady. Perhaps checking fence lines. Jonathan mentioned, then expanding the grazing areas. Thomas's sharp eyes studied her face. Man like that, with good land and prospects, should be thinking about settling down. Jonathan says he's been getting invitations to every social gathering in 3 counties. Mothers pushing their daughters at him like he's the last bachelor in Kansas. The comment stung, though Margaret wasn't sure if her father intended it as a barb or was simply making conversation. Either way, it reinforced her awareness of the vast social gulf between herself and someone like Daniel Morrison. Clara mentioned seeing him at church last Sunday, Ellen offered quietly. Said he was speaking with the widow Patterson about purchasing one of her horses. Smart man, Thomas nodded approvingly. Patterson breeds good stock, though I suppose he could afford the best of everything these days. Heard tell he's bought another section of land east of town. Plans to run cattle year-round instead of depending on seasonal grazing. Margaret cleared the dishes mechanically, her mind churning with doubt. Perhaps Daniel's attention was simply kindness, the sort of charitable interest a successful man might show toward someone he pitied. The possibility made her stomach clench. With humiliation, that night she lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the prairie settling into darkness. Coyotes called in the distance, and the wind rustled through the corn stalks behind the barn. Somewhere out there, Daniel Morrison was probably sleeping peacefully in the comfortable home Jonathan had described, unaware of the chaos his simple invitation had created in her thoughts. Friday evening arrived with unexpected swiftness. Margaret spent the day in a state of nervous energy, cleaning the house with unusual thoroughness and preparing her father's favorite meal. She had told her parents nothing about Daniel's intended visit, partly from cowardice and partly from a superstitious fear that speaking about it would somehow prevent it from happening. At precisely 7 o'clock, the sound of approaching hoofbeats sent Margaret's heart racing. Through the front window, she watched Daniel dismount from his horse with the same easy confidence she had observed at the creek. He had dressed carefully for the occasion, clean trousers, pressed shirt, and a vest that suggested both prosperity and respect for the formality of the call. Thomas opened the door before Daniel could knock, his expression neutral but alert. "Morrison, this is unexpected." "Good evening, Mr. Hawthorne. I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time. I have a matter I'd like to discuss with you, if you have a few minutes." Margaret pressed herself against the kitchen doorframe, heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Her mother had frozen in place near the stove, clearly sensing tension but uncertain of its source. "Come in then," Thomas said gruffly, stepping aside. "Ellen, bring coffee for our guest." The two men settled in the front parlor while Ellen hurried to prepare refreshments. Margaret remained in the kitchen, straining to hear the conversation taking place just yards away. "Mr. Hawthorne," Daniel began, his voice carrying clearly in the evening quiet, "I'll speak plainly. I've had the pleasure of meeting your daughter Margaret on a couple of occasions, and I find her to be a woman of exceptional character and capability. I'd like your permission to escort her to the harvest dance tomorrow evening." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Margaret could picture her father's face, the surprise giving way to suspicion, and to something harder and more calculating. "My daughter Margaret?" Thomas's voice held a note of disbelief that cut like a blade. "You're asking about Margaret?" "Yes, sir, I am." Another pause, longer this time. Margaret closed her eyes, bracing herself for the humiliation she knew was coming. "Mr. Morrison," Thomas said slowly, "I appreciate your kindness, but I think there's been some misunderstanding. Margaret isn't the sort of woman who attracts suitors. She's useful around the farm, certainly, but she's not built for the kind of attention you might pay to other young ladies. Perhaps you'd be better served looking elsewhere for companionship." The rejection was delivered with Thomas's characteristic bluntness, but Margaret detected something else in his tone, a protective anger that surprised her. Her father might view her as plain and unmarriageable, but apparently the idea of someone toying with her affections triggered his sense of family honor. Daniel's response was quiet but firm. "With respect, Mr. Hawthorne, I believe I'm capable of determining my own preferences in companionship. I'm not a young man given to impulsive decisions or cruel jokes. I've observed your daughter's conduct, her character, and her capabilities, and I find all three admirable. My request is made in complete sincerity." "You've observed her?" Thomas's voice sharpened with suspicion. "When? Where?" At your daughter Clara's wedding. And once since then, when I encountered her at Miller's Creek. Our conversations have been brief, but sufficient to convince me that she possesses qualities I value highly: intelligence, kindness, practical competence, and genuine dignity. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. No one had ever described her in such terms, with such apparent conviction. The words felt like gifts she had never expected to receive. I see. Thomas's tone had become thoughtful, calculating. And what exactly are your intentions toward my daughter, assuming I were to consider such an arrangement? Honorable ones, sir. I'd like the opportunity to know her better, to determine if we might be compatible for a more permanent arrangement. I'm at an age where I'm seriously considering marriage, and I believe in making such decisions based on character and compatibility rather than other considerations. The euphemism hung in the air, understood by all parties. Daniel was acknowledging Margaret's lack of conventional beauty, while asserting that it didn't factor into his interest. The statement was both diplomatic and revolutionary. Margaret heard footsteps approaching the kitchen and quickly busied herself with unnecessary tasks. Ellen appeared with the coffee service, her face pale with anxiety. She had clearly been listening as well and understood the magnitude of what was being discussed. Take this to the parlor, Ellen whispered, pressing the tray into Margaret's hands. He asked to speak with you as well. With trembling hands, Margaret carried the coffee into the front room where the two men sat in careful assessment of each other. Daniel rose immediately when she entered, a gesture of respect that sent warmth flooding through her chest. Miss Margaret, he said formally, I've been explaining to your father my hope that you might allow me to escort you to tomorrow's dance. Up close, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful control in his expression. This conversation was costing him effort, and the knowledge that he was willing to spend that effort on her behalf felt precious beyond measure. The decision is yours, Margaret, Thomas said, though his tone suggested the parameters within which that decision should be made. Mr. Morrison has presented his case respectfully. Margaret looked between the two men, her father, whose approval she had spent her life seeking, and this unexpected suitor who saw value where others saw only plainness. The moment felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with safety behind her and unknown possibilities ahead. I would be honored to attend the dance with you, Mr. Morrison, she said quietly. Daniel's smile transformed his entire face, revealing a warmth that made Margaret's breath catch. The honor is mine, Miss Margaret. I'll call for you at 6 o'clock, if that's agreeable. As the men shook hands and Daniel prepared to leave, Margaret felt the ground beneath her feet shifting in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Tomorrow night, she would walk into the Grange Hall on the arm of one of the county's most eligible bachelors, and nothing in her life would ever be quite the same. Saturday evening transformed the Grange Hall into a wonderland of flickering lanterns and autumn decorations. Pumpkins and corn shocks adorned every corner, while strings of colored leaves hung from the rafters. The community had outdone itself preparing for the harvest dance, and excitement buzzed through the air like electricity before a storm. Margaret stood before her bedroom mirror, scarcely recognizing the woman staring back at her. She had chosen her best dress, a deep burgundy wool that Ellen had helped her alter years ago, but which had rarely seen use outside of church services. Her hair, usually braided for practicality, had been carefully arranged in a softer style that framed her face. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to make her feel like someone new, someone worthy of being courted by a gentleman rancher. You look lovely, dear, Ellen said softly from the doorway. Her mother's voice carried notes of pride, worry, and something else, perhaps hope that one of her daughters might find happiness beyond the narrow confines of Thomas Hawthorne's expectations. I feel like I'm wearing a costume, Margaret confessed, smoothing the dress's fabric with nervous hands. What if people stare? What if they whisper about why he chose me? Ellen stepped into the room and placed gentle hands on her daughter's shoulders. "Let them whisper. You're a good woman, Margaret, kind, capable, and deserving of respect. If Mr. Morrison sees that, then he's wiser than most." The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent Margaret's heart racing. Through her window, she could see Daniel dismounting from his horse, and beside him was a small cart decorated with ribbons and pulled by a matched pair of horses. He had clearly put thought into making this evening special, and the gesture touched her more deeply than any elaborate gift might have. Thomas answered Daniel's knock with unusual promptness, his manner formal but no longer openly hostile. The conversation between the two men had apparently earned Daniel a measure of grudging respect, though Margaret suspected her father remained bewildered by the entire situation. "Good evening, Mr. Morrison," Thomas said, stepping aside to allow their guest into the house. "Margaret will be down directly." When Margaret appeared in the front parlor, Daniel's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His eyes widened slightly, and a smile spread across his weathered features, not the polite expression of social courtesy, but genuine appreciation and pleasure. "Miss Margaret," he said, offering a slight bow, "you look absolutely beautiful." The compliment hit her like a physical blow. Beautiful. The word felt foreign, impossible, but the sincerity in Daniel's voice made it difficult to dismiss as mere politeness. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks as she murmured her thanks. "Shall we?" Daniel offered his arm with the same courtesy he might have shown to the county's most celebrated belle. Margaret accepted it, surprised by the solid warmth beneath her fingers and the way his presence seemed to steady her racing nerves. The ride to the Grange Hall passed in comfortable conversation about the changing season, the success of the harvest, and neutral topics that allowed both of them to adjust to this new dynamic between them. Daniel's cart was well sprung and comfortable, and he drove with the easy competence of a man accustomed to handling horses. "Nervous?" he asked as they approached the hall, from which music and laughter already spilled into the evening air. "Terrified," Margaret admitted, then immediately regretted her honesty. "Young ladies probably didn't confess their fears to potential suitors." Daniel chuckled, a warm sound that eased some of her tension. "Good. Shows you understand this matters. I'd be worried if you weren't at least a little nervous." "Are you nervous?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. "Absolutely. I haven't escorted a lady to a dance since I was 17 years old and stepped on Mary Beth Crawford's feet so many times she refused to dance with me again for the rest of the evening." The image of a teenage Daniel Morrison fumbling through dance steps was so endearing that Margaret found herself laughing, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise them both. When was the last time she had laughed without reservation, without worrying about whether her enjoyment might offend someone? As they approached the hall's entrance, Margaret became aware of the attention their arrival was generating. Conversations paused, heads turned, and she could feel the weight of curious stares assessing this unexpected pairing. Mrs. Patterson stood near the door with a cluster of other matrons, her expression somewhere between fascination and disbelief. "Remember," Daniel said quietly as he helped her down from the cart, "you belong here as much as anyone else. Hold your head up." The simple words carried more weight than he probably realized. Margaret straightened her shoulders and allowed Daniel to escort her into the hall, where the full impact of their entrance became apparent. The music continued, but dozens of conversations had stalled as people processed the sight of Cedar Falls. Most eligible bachelor arriving with Thomas Hawthorne's plain daughter, Jonathan and Clara, approached immediately, Clara's face bright with delight and Jonathan wearing an expression of pleased surprise. Margaret felt a rush of gratitude toward her sister, who embraced her warmly and began chattering about the decorations as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Margaret, you look wonderful," Clara exclaimed. "And Daniel, thank you for bringing her. She works so hard, she deserves an evening of fun." Other couples began approaching, some driven by genuine friendliness, others by obvious curiosity. Daniel handled each introduction with the same easy confidence Margaret had observed before, treating her as if she were exactly where she belonged. His behavior gradually influenced others, and the initial awkwardness began to fade into something approaching normalcy. When the fiddle struck up a waltz, Daniel turned to Margaret with a questioning look. "Would you honor me with a dance?" Margaret's throat went dry. "I should warn you, I'm not much of a dancer. My father never saw the point in such instruction." "Then we'll learn together," Daniel replied, offering his hand. The dance floor was crowded with couples, and Margaret felt acutely aware of their visibility as Daniel led her into position. His hand was warm and steady at her waist, and he guided her through the steps with patience and skill. She stumbled twice, stepping on his feet exactly as he had described doing years earlier, but he simply smiled and adjusted their movement without missing a beat. "You're doing fine," he murmured as they turned past the Hendersons and the Pattersons. "Just follow my lead and try to relax." Gradually, Margaret found herself settling into the rhythm. Daniel was an excellent dancer, and his confidence helped compensate for her inexperience. As they moved together across the floor, she became aware of how perfectly they seemed to fit, his height complementing hers, his steady presence balancing her nervousness. "See?" Daniel said as the music wound toward its conclusion. "Natural talent," Margaret laughed breathlessly. "I think you're being generous, but thank you for not letting me embarrass us both." "Impossible," Daniel replied, his eyes holding hers. As the final notes faded, "You could never embarrass me, Margaret." The evening continued with a mixture of dancing, conversation, and shared refreshments. Daniel introduced Margaret to several people she had only known by sight, ranchers from neighboring counties, merchants from larger towns, and other members of the broader community who gathered for such events. Each introduction reinforced the message that he considered her worthy of respect and attention. But it was during a break between dances, when they stepped outside for fresh air, that Margaret experienced the evening's most significant moment. They were standing on the hall's front porch, looking out over the moonlit prairie, when Daniel spoke quietly. "I want to tell you something, Margaret, and I hope you'll hear me out completely before you respond." His serious tone sent alarm bells through her system. Was he having second thoughts? Had the evening shown him something about her that changed his opinion? "When I was in Texas," Daniel continued, "I met a lot of different people. Cowboys, ranchers, town folk, travelers passing through. One thing I learned was that real beauty, the kind that matters, that lasts, isn't what most people think it is. I saw plenty of pretty women who were ugly inside, and I saw women the world might overlook who were absolutely radiant once you got to know them." Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "You're one of those women, Margaret. I've watched you work, seen how you treat people, observed your character when you thought no one was paying attention. You have a light inside you that draws me like nothing I've ever experienced. Your father is wrong about you being too anything to marry. Any man would be lucky to have you." The words hung between them in the cool evening air. Margaret felt tears threatening, and fought them back, not wanting to ruin this perfect moment with emotional displays. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll let me keep calling on you. Say you'll give us a chance to see where this might lead." Before Margaret could respond, the hall's door burst open and several younger people spilled onto the porch, laughing and chattering about the next dance. The intimate moment was broken, but Daniel's words remained, settling into Margaret's heart like seeds in fertile ground. They returned to the dance floor for several more sets, and Margaret found herself relaxing completely for the first time in memory. Daniel's presence gave her confidence, and his obvious enjoyment of her company made her feel valuable in ways she had never experienced. As the evening wound toward its close, Margaret overheard a conversation that brought reality crashing back. She was retrieving her shawl from the coat room when she heard Mrs. Patterson speaking in low, urgent tones to another woman. "I simply cannot understand it, Beatrice. Daniel Morrison could have his pick of any unmarried woman in 3 counties. Pretty girls from good families, girls with dowries and social connections. What could he possibly see in that Hawthorne girl?" "Perhaps he feels sorry for her," the other woman replied. "You know how men can be about charity cases. Maybe he thinks he's being noble. Well, I certainly hope someone has a frank conversation with him before he does something he'll regret. A man in his position needs to think about appearances, about the kind of wife who can help him in business and society. Poor Margaret is sweet enough, I suppose, but she's hardly suitable for someone of his standing." Margaret stood frozen in the coat room, the words hitting like physical blows. All her old insecurities came flooding back, the certainty that she was fooling herself, that Daniel's interest couldn't be genuine, that people would always see her as the plain girl who somehow tricked a good man into paying attention to her. When she emerged from the coat room, Daniel was waiting with their coats, ready for the journey home. If he noticed her sudden change in demeanor, he was too much of a gentleman to comment on it. The ride back to the Hawthorne farm was quieter than their earlier journey. Margaret found herself retreating into the protective shell she had worn for so many years, second-guessing every moment of the evening and wondering if Mrs. Patterson's cool assessment might contain uncomfortable truths. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," she said formally as Daniel helped her down from the cart. "Margaret." Daniel's voice was gentle but concerned. "Did something happen? You seemed different than you were earlier." She wanted to tell him about the conversation she had overheard, to voice her fears and insecurities, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply shook her head and repeated her thanks. Daniel studied her face in the moonlight, clearly recognizing that something had shifted but uncertain how to address it. "May I call on you again next week? Perhaps we could take that ride I mentioned, see some of the countryside." Despite her doubts, despite the cruel voices echoing in her head, Margaret found herself nodding. Whatever his motivations, Daniel Morrison had given her one perfect evening and night when she had felt beautiful, valued, and worthy of attention. Perhaps that was enough, even if it never happened again. "I'd like that," she said softly. Daniel smiled, that warm expression that transformed his entire face. "Then I'll speak with your father about appropriate arrangements. Good night, Margaret. Sweet dreams." As she watched him drive away, Margaret pressed her hand to her chest, where his words from earlier still echoed. "You have a light inside you that draws me like nothing I've ever experienced." Perhaps Mrs. Patterson was right. Perhaps this was all an elaborate gesture of pity or charity. But for tonight, at least, Margaret Hawthorne had been a woman worthy of courting by the finest man she had ever known. And sometimes, she thought, as she quietly entered her father's house, sometimes that was enough to build a future on. The October wind carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves as Margaret made her way to the chicken coop, a basket tucked under her arm for the morning egg collection. 5 days had passed since the harvest dance, and Daniel had yet to call as promised. Each day without word from him felt like confirmation of her worst fears, that Mrs. Patterson's assessment had been correct, that his interest had been fleeting. Born of pity rather than genuine affection. She was reaching into a nest box when the sound of approaching riders made her look up. 2 men on horseback were coming up the lane, Daniel Morrison and another man she didn't recognize. Her heart leaped before she could control it, hope and anxiety warring in her chest as she watched them dismount near the front porch. Margaret quickly finished gathering eggs and hurried toward the house, smoothing her work dress and tucking stray hair behind her ears. Through the kitchen window, she could see her father emerging to greet the visitors, his expression cautious but not unfriendly. "Mr. Morrison," Thomas called as he approached. "Back again so soon?" "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne," Daniel replied, removing his hat. "I'd like you to meet my business partner, Samuel Richardson." "Sam, this is Thomas Hawthorne, Margaret's father." The second man stepped forward with an easy smile. Richardson was shorter than Daniel, with graying hair and laugh lines around his eyes that suggested a naturally cheerful disposition. His handshake with Thomas appeared warm and genuine. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Hawthorne," Richardson said. "Daniel's told me about your fine family and excellent farm. Beautiful country you have here." Thomas's chest puffed slightly with pride. Compliments about his land always pleased him, and Margaret could see him warming to Richardson's friendly manner. "Been in the family for 20 years. Built it up from nothing but prairie grass and determination." "That's the way of it out here," Richardson agreed. "Takes a special kind of man to make something from nothing. Daniel and I are hoping to do similar work with our cattle operation." Margaret hovered near the kitchen door, uncertain whether to make her presence known or remain out of sight. The decision was made for her when Daniel's eyes found hers through the window. His face lit up with the same genuine pleasure she remembered from the dance, and he touched his hat brim in greeting. "Is Miss Margaret available?" Daniel asked Thomas. "Sam and I were wondering if she might like to join us for a ride around the countryside. With your permission, of course. Sam's thinking about bringing his wife out from St. Louis next spring, and I thought Margaret might have some insights about what would appeal to a lady setting up a new household." The request was carefully crafted, Margaret realized. By including Richardson and mentioning his wife, Daniel was providing both chaperonage and a practical reason for seeking her company. Thomas would find it difficult to object to such a reasonable arrangement. "I suppose that would be acceptable," Thomas said slowly. "Margaret does know her way around domestic matters. But mind you're back before dark. I won't have people talking about my daughter riding around the countryside at all hours." Margaret changed quickly into her better riding skirt and joined the men outside, where Daniel had arranged for a gentle mare from the Whitmore stable. As they set off across the rolling prairie, Richardson immediately began asking practical questions about life in Kansas, where to purchase household goods, which merchants were reliable, what challenges his wife might face in adapting to frontier life. Margaret found herself relaxing as she answered his questions. Richardson's queries were genuine, not mere politeness, and his obvious love for his absent wife created a comfortable atmosphere that took pressure off her interaction with Daniel. "Anna's always lived in cities," Richardson explained as they paused to rest the horses near a grove of cottonwoods. "She's excited about the move, but I worry she doesn't fully understand how different life will be out here." "The isolation can be difficult at first," Margaret admitted. "But there are compensations. The community is close-knit. People help each other during hardships, and there's a freedom here that cities don't offer." "What kind of freedom?" Richardson asked, genuinely curious. Margaret considered the question carefully. "Freedom to be yourself, I suppose. In a small community, people know your character rather than just your circumstances. A woman can be valued for her capabilities rather than just her appearance or family connections." Daniel's eyes met hers as she spoke, and she saw approval and understanding in his gaze. He had been listening carefully to her words, and she sensed that her perspective mattered to him in ways that went beyond mere politeness. As they rode toward Daniel's property, the conversation shifted to his plans for expansion. Richardson was clearly the financial partner in their enterprise, while Daniel provided the practical knowledge of cattle raising and land management. Their partnership seemed built on mutual respect and complementary skills. The new section. "We purchased borders Miller's Creek," Daniel explained as they crested a hill that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding countryside. "Good water, decent grazing, and close enough to existing operations that we won't need to build entirely. New infrastructure." Margaret found herself genuinely interested in their plans. The challenge of building something from raw land appealed to her practical nature, and she asked questions about water rights, seasonal grazing patterns, and the logistics of managing larger herds. You have a good head for this kind of thinking, Richardson observed. Daniel wasn't exaggerating when he said you understood practical matters. The comment sent warmth through Margaret's chest. Daniel had been discussing her with his business partner, presenting her as someone worth consulting, rather than merely tolerating. The knowledge that he valued her opinions enough to share them with others felt more precious than any conventional compliment. As they rode through the property Daniel and Richardson were developing, Margaret began to see the scope of their vision. They weren't simply running cattle. They were building an integrated operation that would support multiple families and contribute to the broader community's growth. The railroad spur they're planning will come within 10 miles of here, Daniel explained, pointing toward the eastern horizon. That'll make shipping cattle much more practical and profitable. We're positioning ourselves to take advantage of the changing transportation situation. Have you considered what other enterprises might benefit from railroad access? Margaret asked. Grain shipping, lumber transport, passenger service? Richardson's eyebrows rose with interest. What are you thinking? Well, Margaret said, warming to the topic, if the railroad brings easier transportation, it might also bring new settlers. They'll need supplies, services, entertainment. A community that positions itself as a regional center could benefit from more than just cattle shipping. Daniel reined in his horse and stared at her with obvious admiration. That's brilliant thinking, Margaret. We've been so focused on the cattle operation that we haven't considered the broader implications. The rest of the afternoon passed in animated discussion of possibilities and challenges. Margaret found herself contributing ideas and observations that both men received with genuine interest. For the first time in her life, she was participating in a conversation about business and planning as an equal partner rather than a silent observer. As they prepared to return to the Hawthorne farm, Richardson excused himself to examine a fence line, leaving Daniel and Margaret momentarily alone. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the prairie grass in shades of gold and amber. I need to apologize, Daniel said without preamble. I promised to call on you this week, and I've kept you waiting. Sam arrived unexpectedly from St. Louis, and we've been dealing with some urgent business matters. Margaret felt a rush of relief that nearly made her dizzy. I thought perhaps you'd reconsidered, she admitted quietly. Daniel's expression grew serious. Margaret, I need you to understand something. I don't make promises lightly, and I don't change my mind without good reason. When I say I want to spend time with you, I mean it completely. People talk, Margaret said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. They wonder why someone like you would be interested in someone like me. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. What people are you referring to? Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. She hadn't meant to reveal her eavesdropping at the dance, but the words were out now. Mrs. Patterson and some of the other ladies. They think you're being charitable, or that you'll come to your senses and realize you could do better. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment Margaret glimpsed the steel beneath his gentle demeanor. Mrs. Patterson is a gossip who measures everyone by her own shallow standards. The fact that she can't understand my interest in you says more about her limitations than about your worth. But what if she's right? Margaret whispered. What if you do realize you could have someone prettier, more accomplished, more suitable for your position? Daniel dismounted and walked to her horse, reaching up to help her down. When her feet touched the ground, he kept his hands on her waist, his eyes holding hers with unwavering directness. Margaret, I've traveled from Texas to Missouri, from Kansas City to Denver. I've met debutantes and farmers' daughters, city ladies, and frontier women. I've seen every type of beauty the world has to offer, and I'm telling you something I want you to remember. You are the most genuinely attractive woman I've ever encountered. Daniel, let me finish, he said gently. I'm not talking about the kind of pretty that fades with age or disappears the moment someone becomes angry or tired. I'm talking about the beauty that comes from character, from kindness, from intelligence, and strength and genuine goodness. That's what draws me to you, and that's something that doesn't change based on other people's opinions. Margaret felt tears threatening and blinked them back. I'm not used to being valued, she admitted. I don't know how to trust that it's real. Then let me prove it to you, Daniel said simply. Give me time to show you that my feelings are genuine, that they're based on who you are rather than pity or charity or any other motivation Mrs. Patterson might imagine. Richardson's return interrupted the moment, but as they rode back toward the Hawthorne farm, Margaret felt something settling into place inside her chest. Daniel's words carried a conviction that was difficult to dismiss, and his actions consistently supported his declarations. That evening at supper, Thomas surprised everyone by speaking approvingly of the afternoon's excursion. Morrison and his partner asked good questions, he told Ellen as Margaret served the meal she had hurriedly prepared after returning from the ride. Practical men with solid plans. Richardson particularly wanted to know about Margaret's insights into frontier living. Ellen looked up with interest. They asked Margaret's opinions about business matters, seemed to value her thoughts on community development and the implications of railroad access. Thomas continued, his tone suggesting this surprised him as much as anyone. Richardson said she had a good head for practical planning. Margaret felt a flush of pride at her father's grudging approval. Thomas Hawthorne rarely praised anyone and never praised her for anything beyond domestic competence. The knowledge that outsiders had valued her contributions enough to influence even his rigid opinions felt like a small victory. Later that night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she found herself replaying the afternoon's conversations for hours. She had been treated as an intelligent adult whose ideas mattered, whose perspectives were worth considering. Daniel and Richardson had listened to her thoughts about business development, community planning, and frontier challenges with the same attention they paid to each other's suggestions. The experience had been intoxicating in ways she was only beginning to understand. All her life, she had been valued primarily for her ability to work hard and cause no trouble. The possibility that someone might prize her mind, her insights, and her character felt revolutionary. As she brushed her hair in the lamplight, Margaret allowed herself to hope that Daniel Morrison's interest was exactly what he claimed it to be, recognition of qualities in her that went far deeper than surface appearances. Mrs. Patterson and her gossiping friends could speculate all they wanted. Margaret was beginning to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she was worth exactly the kind of attention Daniel was offering. And if that was true, if a man of his caliber could genuinely care for someone like her, then maybe her father's cool assessment of her marriage prospects had been wrong all along. November brought the first hard frost to Cedar Falls, turning the prairie grass silver in the early morning light. Margaret stood at her bedroom window, watching Daniel's familiar figure approach on horseback through the crystalline air. 3 weeks had passed since their countryside ride with Samuel Richardson, and Daniel had become a regular visitor to the Hawthorne farm. His courtship had settled into a comfortable rhythm of Sunday afternoon calls, occasional rides when the weather permitted, and increasingly frequent conversations about everything from cattle prices to political developments in the territorial capital. What surprised Margaret most was how natural their growing relationship felt. She had expected courtship to be an elaborate performance, full of artificial politeness and careful maneuvering. Instead, she found herself talking with Daniel as she had never talked with anyone openly, honestly, without the constant fear of saying something wrong or revealing too much of her true thoughts. This morning's visit, however, felt different. Daniel had sent word the previous evening that he needed to discuss something important with both Margaret and her father. The formal tone of his message had set her nerves on edge, and she had spent a sleepless night imagining various scenarios, none of them particularly encouraging. "Margaret, he's here," Ellen called from downstairs. her voice carrying the same tension that had affected the entire household since Daniel's message arrived. Margaret made her way to the front parlor, where she found Daniel standing near the fireplace, hat in hand. His usual easy confidence seemed strained, and there was something in his posture that suggested this conversation would indeed be significant. Thomas entered from the kitchen, his expression carefully neutral but alert. Over the past month, his attitude toward Daniel had evolved from suspicion to grudging respect. The younger man's obvious prosperity, combined with his respectful treatment of Margaret and his practical knowledge of farming and ranching, had gradually won Thomas's approval. "Morrison," Thomas said with a nod. "Ellen's putting coffee on. You said you had something particular to discuss." Daniel cleared his throat, his eyes finding Margaret's before addressing her father. "Mr. Hawthorne, I've been calling on your daughter for over a month now, and I believe we've come to know each other well enough for me to speak about my intentions." Margaret's heart began racing so fast she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. This was the conversation she had both hoped for and dreaded, the moment when Daniel would either formalize their relationship or find a graceful way to end it. "I'm in love with Margaret," Daniel continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was declaring. "I believe she's the finest woman I've ever known, and I would like your permission to ask for her hand in marriage." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Margaret felt the world tilt slightly, as if the familiar parlor had become foreign territory. Thomas's face showed a succession of emotions: surprise, calculation, and something that might have been the beginning of pleasure. "Marriage," Thomas repeated slowly, as if testing the word. "You're serious about this?" "Completely serious, sir. I've given this considerable thought, and I'm certain of my feelings and my intentions." Thomas turned to study Margaret, his expression unreadable. "And what does Margaret think about this proposal?" Margaret realized that both men were looking at her expectantly, waiting for her response to a question that hadn't actually been asked yet. Her mouth felt dry, and her hands were trembling so badly she clasped them together to hide the shaking. "Mr. Morrison hasn't actually proposed to me yet," she managed to say. "He's asking your permission to do so." Daniel's face broke into a smile that transformed his entire expression. "You're absolutely right. I'm getting ahead of myself." He crossed the room and dropped to one knee in front of Margaret's chair, taking her hands in his warm grasp. "Margaret Hawthorne," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet room, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Time seemed suspended. Margaret stared down at this good, kind man who was offering her everything she had never dared to dream of: love, respect, partnership, a future filled with possibilities instead of limitations. The girl who had been told she was too ugly to marry was being proposed to by the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties. "Yes," she whispered, then cleared her throat and said it again with more strength. "Yes, Daniel, I will marry you." Daniel's smile was radiant as he rose and, with Thomas watching approvingly, placed a gentle kiss on Margaret's cheek. "Thank you," he said softly. "You've made me the happiest man in Kansas." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of practical discussions. Daniel had clearly thought through the logistics of their marriage with the same thoroughness he applied to his business ventures. He proposed a spring wedding, which would give Margaret time to prepare and allow him to complete the construction of a new house on his property. "I want you to have your own home," he explained to Margaret, as Thomas nodded approvingly. "Not just a room added onto an existing structure, but a house designed specifically for our life together." The consideration behind this gesture touched Margaret deeply. Many men would expect their wives to adapt to existing arrangements, but Daniel was planning to build something new, something that would belong to both of them equally. As they discussed wedding dates and guest lists, Ellen emerged from the kitchen with coffee and the news that she had seen Clara approaching on horseback. Within minutes, the parlor was filled with excited chatter as Clara embraced her sister and demanded to hear every detail of the proposal. "I knew it," Clara exclaimed, her eyes bright with joy. I told Jonathan weeks ago that Daniel Morrison was completely smitten. The way he looked at you during our wedding dance, I'd never seen a man so thoroughly captivated. Margaret felt a rush of gratitude toward her sister, whose genuine happiness helped counteract the voices in her head that whispered this was all too good to be true. Clara's enthusiasm was infectious, and soon she and Ellen were deep in discussion about wedding preparations while Margaret and Daniel stepped outside for a private conversation. Are you certain about this? Margaret asked once they were alone on the front porch. Because once word gets out, there won't be any graceful way to change your mind. Daniel took her hands, his expression serious but warm. Margaret, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. But I need to ask you the same question. Are you marrying me because you love me, or because I'm offering you escape from a difficult situation? The question was fair, and Margaret appreciated his directness. Both, I suppose, she said honestly. I do love you, Daniel. More than I thought possible. But I also can't deny that marriage to you means freedom from certain limitations. I want you to be happy, Daniel said simply. Not just grateful, not just relieved, but genuinely happy. If there's anything about our future that concerns you, anything you want to discuss or change, I need you to tell me now. Margaret considered his words carefully. There was one concern that had been growing in her mind, one fear she hadn't yet voiced. People will always wonder why you chose me, she said quietly. They'll assume you settled for less than you could have had, and they'll pity you for it. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. Let me worry about other people's opinions. The only person whose thoughts matter to me is standing right here. But what if they're right? What if you wake up one morning and realize you could have married someone prettier, more accomplished, better suited to your position in the community? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying her face with the same intensity she had noticed during their first conversation. Margaret, do you remember what you said about frontier freedom? About being valued for your character rather than your circumstances? She nodded. That's exactly what I'm doing. I'm choosing to marry you because of who you are, not despite who you aren't. Your intelligence, your kindness, your strength, your capacity for hard work, your genuine goodness, those are the qualities I want in a wife. Those are the qualities I want my children to inherit. The mention of children sent a flutter of excitement and terror through Margaret's chest. She had rarely allowed herself to imagine a future that included motherhood, but suddenly, the possibility seemed real and immediate. Besides, Daniel continued with a smile, I have a feeling that once people get to know you as I do, they'll wonder how I managed to convince you to marry me. News of their engagement spread through Cedar Falls with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. By evening, neighbors were arriving to offer congratulations, and Margaret found herself the center of attention in ways that felt both wonderful and overwhelming. Mrs. Patterson arrived with her daughter Emily, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes bright with curiosity. What wonderful news, she said to Margaret, though her tone suggested she was still processing the reality of the situation. You must be very surprised by this development. I'm very happy, Margaret replied evenly, refusing to rise to the implicit suggestion that Daniel's proposal was unexpected or undeserved. Of course, dear. And I'm sure you'll make a very suitable wife for Mr. Morrison. He's such a practical man, after all. Emily Patterson, a pretty blonde girl of 19 who had been among the women openly pursuing Daniel's attention, looked genuinely confused by the turn of events. Miss Hawthorne, she said with apparent sincerity, you must tell me your secret. I've been trying to catch Daniel Morrison's eye for months. Margaret felt a moment of pity for the girl, who clearly couldn't understand how character might matter more than conventional beauty. I don't think there's any secret, Miss Patterson. Mr. Morrison and I simply discovered we were compatible. As the evening progressed, Margaret observed the various reactions to her engagement with growing confidence. Some visitors seemed genuinely pleased for her happiness. Others appeared baffled by Daniel's choice but were too polite to express their confusion directly. A few, like Mrs. Patterson, clearly viewed the engagement as confirmation that men were fundamentally unpredictable creatures whose decisions defied rational explanation. But the reaction that mattered most came from Jonathan, who arrived with Clara as the evening was winding down. He embraced Margaret warmly and spoke with obvious sincerity. "I'm so happy for both of you," he said. "Daniel's been like a brother to me since he came to Kansas, and I've never seen him so content as he's been these past weeks. You're exactly what he needed, Margaret." Later, as the last visitors departed and the family prepared for bed, Margaret found herself alone with Ellen in the kitchen. Her mother worked quietly, cleaning the coffee cups and straightening the room, but there was something in her manner that suggested she had things to say. "Mama?" Margaret asked softly. Ellen turned, and Margaret was startled to see tears in her mother's eyes. "I'm so proud of you," Ellen said quietly, "and so grateful that you'll have the kind of marriage I always hoped for you, one based on love and respect rather than mere convenience." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Ellen's own marriage had been arranged by practical considerations rather than romantic attachment, and Margaret realized her mother was living vicariously through her daughter's happiness. "He's a good man, Mama. He makes me feel valuable." "You are valuable," Ellen said firmly. "You always have been. I'm just glad you found someone who recognizes it." As Margaret prepared for bed that night, she reflected on the day's extraordinary events. This morning she had been Thomas Hawthorne's unmarriageable daughter, destined for spinsterhood and grudging tolerance. Tonight she was Daniel Morrison's fiancée, planning a spring wedding and a future filled with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The transformation felt surreal, but it was grounded in something solid and real. Daniel's consistent demonstration of his feelings, his obvious respect for her character, and his practical planning for their shared future. Mrs. Patterson and her ilk could gossip all they wanted. Margaret was beginning to understand that their opinions mattered far less than she had once believed. She was going to be married to a man who loved her, not despite her plainness, but because he saw beauty in places other people never thought to look. And that, Margaret thought as she blew out her bedside lamp, was worth more than all the conventional prettiness in the world. Winter settled over Cedar Falls like a heavy quilt, blanketing the prairie in snow and forcing the community indoors for long stretches of enforced intimacy. Margaret found these months both challenging and transformative as her engagement to Daniel became an established fact that even the most determined gossips were forced to accept. The construction of their future home had begun in late November. Despite the approaching cold, Daniel insisted on building through the winter months, employing local craftsmen who welcomed the steady work during the traditionally lean season. Margaret visited the building site regularly, watching their future take shape board by board, nail by nail. "What do you think of the kitchen placement?" Daniel asked during one particularly cold February afternoon as they stood in what would eventually be their front parlor. Snow crunched under their feet, and their breath formed clouds in the frigid air. But Margaret could envision the completed rooms with startling clarity. The kitchen was positioned to catch the morning sun, with windows facing east toward the creek and south toward the garden plot Daniel had planned. A large pantry connected to the main food preparation area, and a separate room would house the newest innovation, a cast-iron cookstove ordered specially from Chicago. "It's perfect," Margaret said, meaning every word. "The light will be wonderful for food preparation, and having the pantry so close will save countless steps." Daniel smiled, his satisfaction evident despite the cold that reddened his cheeks. "I wanted everything designed around practical efficiency." Samuel's wife Anna sent detailed suggestions from St. Louis about modern household arrangements. "She's quite excited about helping you set up housekeeping." The mention of Anna Richardson reminded Margaret of the broader community that was forming around Daniel's expanding business interests. Samuel had decided to bring his wife west earlier than originally planned, recognizing that the ranch operation would benefit from a woman's perspective on domestic arrangements. Anna was expected to arrive on the spring train, full of city ideas about organization and decoration. "Are you nervous about meeting her?" Daniel asked, apparently reading Margaret's expression. "A little," Margaret admitted. "I've never spent much time around city ladies. What if we don't have anything in common?" Anna Richardson spent the first 15 years of her marriage following Samuel from one frontier town to another, Daniel replied. "She understands practical living, and Samuel says she's looking forward to having another woman nearby who shares her interests in making comfortable homes from raw materials." As they walked through the frame of what would be the bedroom, Margaret felt a flutter of awareness about the intimacies of married life that awaited her. She and Daniel had maintained careful propriety throughout their courtship, with conversations and shared activities always occurring under appropriate supervision. But marriage would bring privacy, physical closeness, and responsibilities she had only heard whispered about among married women. "Margaret," Daniel said softly, apparently sensing her thoughts, "there's something I want to discuss with you, and I hope you'll feel comfortable being completely honest with me." Her heart rate quickened, unsure what topic might require such a serious preamble. "Marriage will bring changes for both of us," he continued carefully. "Intimate changes that I suspect no one has prepared you for very thoroughly. I want you to know that I understand this might cause you some anxiety, and I want you to feel free to ask questions or express concerns." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold air. Conversations about marital intimacy were rare, and usually conducted in euphemisms so vague as to be nearly meaningless. Her mother had offered only the most basic guidance, and Margaret's understanding came primarily from observations of farm animals and fragments of overheard conversations. "I am nervous about that," she admitted quietly. "I don't really know what to expect." Daniel nodded with understanding. "I thought as much. Would it help if I told you that physical intimacy between married people should be about mutual care and consideration? That it's not something that should cause you fear or discomfort?" The frankness of his approach surprised and relieved her. "Yes, that does help. I was worried that I might not know how to be a proper wife." "Margaret," Daniel said, taking her mittened hands in his, "you couldn't be anything but a proper wife. Your natural kindness and consideration will guide you in marriage, just as they guide you in everything else." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jonathan and Clara, who had driven over to see the construction progress. Clara's excitement about the house was infectious, and she immediately began planning how Margaret might arrange furniture and household goods. "You simply must put the dining table here," Clara declared, standing in the center of what would become the main living area. "The light from both windows will make it perfect for entertaining, and it's close enough to the kitchen for easy serving." Jonathan examined the construction work with the critical eye of someone who understood building techniques. "Good solid framing," he observed approvingly. "This house will stand for generations." The comment sent a thrill through Margaret. Generations. The possibility that she and Daniel might fill this house with children, that their family might grow and prosper within these walls, felt both wonderful and overwhelming. As they prepared to leave, Clara pulled Margaret aside for a private conversation. "Are you happy?" she asked directly, studying her sister's face with concerned attention. "Very happy," Margaret replied, surprised by how confidently the words came. "More than I ever thought possible." "Good, because I was worried at first that you might be marrying Daniel for the wrong reasons, to escape Papa's harsh treatment, or because you felt you had to accept the first proposal you received." Margaret considered her sister's concern carefully. "I won't pretend those things don't matter. Marriage to Daniel does represent freedom from Papa's criticism and a future I could never have imagined. But Clara, I genuinely love him. Not just for what he offers me, but for who he is. Clara's relief was evident. I can see that when you're together. You light up in ways I've never seen before. And Daniel ... He looks at you like you're the most precious thing in the world. As March arrived and the worst of winter's grip began to loosen, Margaret found herself caught up in the practical preparations for married life. Anna Richardson had arrived from St. Louis, bringing with her a wealth of knowledge about household organization and modern conveniences. To Margaret's relief, Anna proved to be a warm, practical woman who was delighted to share her expertise. The secret to efficient housekeeping, Anna explained as they inventoried linens and kitchen equipment in the nearly completed house, is having everything positioned where it's most useful, not necessarily where it's most decorative. Anna had brought catalogs from St. Louis merchants, and she helped Margaret select everything from curtain fabric to cooking implements. The process of choosing items for her own household felt miraculous after years of making do with whatever her father deemed necessary. Margaret was learning to consider her own preferences and needs. Daniel wants you to have the finest of everything, Anna observed as they discussed table settings and serving pieces. He's invested considerable thought in making your domestic life as comfortable as possible. He's very thoughtful, Margaret agreed, then hesitated before adding, Anna, may I ask you something personal? Of course, dear. When you first married Samuel, were you nervous about the intimate aspects of marriage? Anna's expression grew gentle and understanding. Terrified, she admitted frankly. No one had explained anything clearly, and I was convinced I would somehow fail at being a proper wife. What helped you overcome those fears? Samuel's patience mostly, and the gradual understanding that marriage is a partnership in all things, including physical intimacy. When both people care about each other's comfort and happiness, everything else tends to work itself out naturally. The conversation provided Margaret with reassurance she hadn't known she needed. Anna's frank acknowledgement that fear was normal, combined with her obvious contentment in her own marriage, helped ease anxieties that had been building as the wedding date approached. As April brought warmer weather and the first signs of spring, the pace of wedding preparations intensified. The house was nearing completion, and Daniel had arranged for furniture to be delivered from Kansas City. The community was planning a celebration that would include families from neighboring counties, reflecting both Daniel's standing in the region and the genuine affection many people had developed for Margaret, but it was during a fitting for her wedding dress that Margaret experienced the most significant challenge to her newfound confidence. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on helping with the final alterations, and her running commentary gradually revealed the depth of her disapproval. Of course, the style will need to be quite simple, Mrs. Patterson declared as she pinned the hem. Nothing too elaborate would be ... appropriate for someone in Margaret's position. What do you mean by my position? Margaret asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Well, dear, let's be realistic. This isn't exactly a love match in the conventional sense, is it? Mr. Morrison is clearly motivated by practical considerations. Perhaps he needs a capable housekeeper. Or he's decided that beauty isn't as important as domestic efficiency. Margaret felt the familiar stab of pain that Mrs. Patterson's words always brought, but this time something else rose alongside the hurt anger. Pure, cleansing anger at the woman's presumption and cruelty. Mrs. Patterson, Margaret said quietly, I think you're mistaken about Mr. Morrison's motivations. But even if you weren't, I fail to see how they concern you. The older woman's eyebrows rose in surprise. Margaret had never spoken back to her before, never challenged her pronouncements or defended herself against her subtle attacks. I'm simply trying to help you understand the reality of your situation, Mrs. Patterson replied stiffly. Men like Daniel Morrison don't ordinarily choose wives like you unless there are compelling practical reasons. Then perhaps, Margaret said, standing straighter despite the pins and partially sewn seams, Men like Daniel Morrison are wiser than you give them credit for being. Perhaps they understand that a good marriage requires more than just a pretty face. Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching alarm. The meek, self-deprecating girl she had tormented for years was disappearing, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and refused to accept casual cruelty. "Well," Mrs. Patterson huffed, gathering her sewing supplies with obvious displeasure, "I suppose we'll see how long such practical arrangements actually last." After she left, Margaret stood alone in the bedroom that had witnessed so many moments of self-doubt and despair. But instead of the usual crushing shame that followed encounters with Mrs. Patterson, she felt something new, a deep, unshakable certainty that Daniel Morrison's love was real, that her own value was genuine, and that no amount of gossip or speculation could diminish either truth. 3 weeks before her wedding, Margaret Hawthorne finally understood what Daniel had been trying to tell her all along. She was worthy of love not because someone had lowered their standards to accept her, but because she possessed qualities that mattered more than conventional beauty. And any person who couldn't see that, Mrs. Patterson included, revealed more about their own limitations than about her worth. The realization felt like stepping out of a dark room into brilliant sunlight. After 26 years of believing her father's harsh assessment of her marriage prospects, Margaret was finally ready to embrace the truth that Daniel Morrison had seen from the very beginning. She was exactly the woman he wanted. Exactly as she was. May sunshine streamed through the windows of the completed Morrison house as Margaret stood in what would soon be her own kitchen, supervising the arrangement of wedding gifts and household necessities. The past week had brought a steady stream of deliveries, furniture from Kansas City, linens from St. Louis, and an endless parade of gifts from neighbors and friends who had embraced the upcoming celebration with surprising enthusiasm. The wedding was set for the following Saturday, and Margaret found herself moving through the final preparations with a calm confidence that surprised everyone, including herself. The anxious, self-doubting woman of 6 months ago had been replaced by someone who understood her own value and looked forward to her future with genuine excitement rather than desperate gratitude. "The china looks lovely on those shelves," Anna Richardson observed as she helped arrange the good dishes Daniel had insisted on ordering from Fine Pottery Works in Ohio. "You'll have the most modern kitchen in the 3 counties." Margaret ran her fingers along the smooth surface of the new cookstove, marveling at its efficient design and the promise of easier meal preparation it represented. Everything in the house reflected Daniel's thoughtful consideration for her comfort and convenience, from the spacious pantry to the large windows that filled every room with natural light. "Anna," Margaret said as they worked, "I need to thank you for something." "What's that, dear?" "For treating me like a normal bride instead of some charity case who got lucky. You have no idea how much that's meant to me." Anna paused in her arrangement of serving bowls to study Margaret's face. "My dear girl, anyone who thinks you're a charity case is blind to what really matters in a marriage. Daniel Morrison is getting exactly what he wants: an intelligent, capable woman who will be a true partner in building their life together." The sound of approaching wagons interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see Clara and Ellen arriving with the final load of Margaret's personal belongings, the few items she would bring from her father's house to her new home. Behind them came Daniel and Jonathan, returning from a morning spent with the cattle that would form the foundation of their expanded operation. Margaret met them at the front door, and Daniel's face lit up with the expression of pure joy that still took her breath away. Even now, after months of consistent attention, she sometimes couldn't quite believe that someone looked at her with such obvious delight. "How does it feel to be standing in your own house?" Daniel asked, taking her hands as he stepped inside. "Surreal," Margaret admitted. "Wonderful, but surreal." Daniel's eyes swept the main room, taking in the carefully arranged furniture and the touches that were already making the space feel like home. Wait until you see the surprise Samuel and I finished this morning. He led her through the house, to the back door where a new structure had appeared overnight, a spacious chicken coop with attached runs, complete with nesting boxes and a small storage area for feed. I know how much you enjoy working with the chickens at your father's place, Daniel explained. I thought you might like to start your own flock here. Margaret stared at the thoughtfully designed structure, overwhelmed by the care behind this gesture. Daniel had noticed and remembered something as simple as her fondness for tending chickens, then taken the time to create a space where she could pursue that interest in their new life together. It's perfect, she said softly. Thank you for thinking of it. I want this to feel like your home from the very beginning, Daniel replied. Not just a place where you're living, but a place where you can pursue your own interests and projects. As they returned to the house, Margaret noticed Ellen standing alone in the main room, her expression thoughtful and somewhat sad. When the others moved on to examine other aspects of the house, Margaret approached her mother quietly. What are you thinking about, Mama? Ellen's smile was wistful. Just remembering what it felt like to be a young bride, full of hopes and dreams about the future. Watching you now brings back those memories. Are you happy for me? Margaret asked, though she thought she knew the answer. Happier than I can express, Ellen replied firmly. You're getting the kind of marriage I always wanted for you, one based on mutual respect and genuine affection. That's rarer than most people realize. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the traveling preacher who would officiate at Saturday's ceremony. Reverend Mitchell was a circuit minister who served the scattered communities of western Kansas, a man known for his practical wisdom and his ability to adapt religious ceremonies to frontier realities. Miss Hawthorne, he said warmly, I understand congratulations are in order. Mr. Morrison tells me you two are eager to begin your married life. Very eager, Reverend, Margaret replied, surprised by her own boldness in expressing such sentiments. Openly. Reverend Mitchell's eyes crinkled with approval. Good. Too many couples approach marriage like they're facing an ordeal instead of celebrating a blessing. Your enthusiasm speaks well for your future happiness. As the afternoon progressed, Margaret found herself at the center of a gathering that felt more like a family celebration than a formal pre-wedding visit. Jonathan and Daniel discussed plans for expanding their cattle operation, while Clara and Anna debated the merits of different approaches to organizing household linens. Ellen and Reverend Mitchell discovered a shared interest in herb gardening, and soon they were deep in conversation about medicinal plants and their cultivation. But the most significant conversation occurred when Thomas arrived unexpectedly, his expression serious but not unfriendly. Margaret felt the familiar tension that always accompanied her father's presence, but this time it was tempered by her new confidence and the support of the people around her. Morrison, Thomas said with a nod toward Daniel, I wanted to speak with you privately before Saturday's ceremony. The two men stepped outside, leaving Margaret to wonder what her father might want to discuss. Through the window, she could see them talking earnestly, their body language suggesting a serious but not hostile conversation. 20 minutes later, they returned with expressions that seemed somehow lighter, more relaxed. Thomas approached Margaret with an unfamiliar gentleness in his manner. Margaret, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. The words hit her like a physical shock. In her entire life, she could not remember her father ever apologizing to anyone, much less to her. I've spent years telling you that no decent man would want to marry you, Thomas continued, his voice rough with uncharacteristic emotion. I was wrong about that, and I was wrong about your worth as a woman. Morrison has helped me understand that I've been measuring you by the wrong standards. Margaret felt tears threatening, but these were different from the tears of hurt and humiliation she had shed so often in the past. These came from a deep well of relief and vindication. Thank you, Papa, she said softly. That means more to me than you know. Thomas nodded awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional territory they were navigating. "You'll make a fine wife, Margaret. Morrison is lucky to have you." As evening approached and the various visitors prepared to return to their own homes, Margaret found herself alone with Daniel for a few precious minutes. They stood on the front porch of their nearly completed house, watching the sun set over the prairie that would soon be their shared domain. "What did you and my father talk about?" Margaret asked. Daniel smiled mysteriously. "Man-to-man conversation. Nothing you need to worry about. Daniel Morrison, you're being deliberately evasive." "Maybe. A little," he admitted. "Your father wanted to make sure I understood what a treasure I was getting. He also wanted to express some regrets about how he's treated you over the years." Margaret was quiet for a moment, processing this unexpected development. "He's never been one for apologies or admissions of error. I think our engagement has forced him to reconsider some of his assumptions," Daniel replied diplomatically. "Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to help us see things more clearly." As they prepared to part ways for the evening, Margaret would spend her final unmarried nights at her father's house. Daniel took her hands in the gesture that had become familiar and precious to her. "Margaret, in 3 days you'll be my wife. Are you ready for that?" The question was asked seriously, giving her space to voice any remaining doubts or concerns. But as Margaret looked into his steady, loving eyes, she realized that she was indeed ready, not just to escape her old life, but to embrace a new one built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and genuine partnership. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "More than ready." Daniel's kiss was gentle but firm, a promise of the intimacy and closeness that awaited them as husband and wife. When they parted, Margaret felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with the deep contentment of knowing she was exactly where she belonged. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of final preparations. Margaret's wedding dress was completed with Anna's expert assistance, a creation in ivory silk that transformed her into someone she barely recognized as herself. Neighbors arrived to help with food preparation, house decoration, and the countless details that frontier weddings required. But perhaps the most meaningful preparation occurred on Friday evening, when Ellen sat with Margaret in her childhood bedroom for their final mother-daughter conversation as unmarried women. "I want to tell you something about marriage," Ellen sighed, her voice soft in the lamplight. "Something I wish someone had told me when I was your age." Margaret waited, sensing the importance of whatever her mother was about to share. "Marriage will change you," Ellen continued. "Not in ways that make you less yourself, but in ways that help you become more yourself. A good husband, and Daniel is a very good man, will see possibilities in you that you never knew existed. He'll encourage you to grow in directions you never imagined. Is that what Papa did for you?" Margaret asked gently. Ellen's smile was sad but not bitter. "Your father and I had a different kind of marriage. But that doesn't mean I don't understand what a good marriage can be. And what you and Daniel have, that's the real thing, Margaret. That's the kind of love that builds strong families and happy lives." As Margaret prepared for sleep on her last night as Miss Hawthorne, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a woman convinced of her own unworthiness, resigned to a life of loneliness and service to others. Now she was hours away from marrying a man who saw her as a prize worth winning, a partner worth cherishing, a woman worthy of the kind of love she had never dared to dream of. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. It had required her to challenge assumptions she had held about herself for decades, to risk believing in possibilities that seemed too good to be true, and to gradually accept that perhaps her father's cruel assessment of her worth had been wrong all along. Tomorrow, Margaret Hawthorne would become Margaret Morrison, and in doing so, she would complete a journey from self-doubt to self-acceptance that had been as important as any romance. She was marrying Daniel not because she was desperate for any proposal, but because she had finally learned to value herself enough to recognize genuine love when it was offered, and that, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, made all the difference in the world. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made the Kansas prairie seem to stretch endlessly in all directions. Margaret woke before sunrise, not from anxiety, but from excitement, a feeling so foreign to her previous experience that she lay in bed for several minutes, simply marveling at it. Today, she would marry Daniel Morrison. The thought no longer carried the disbelief and wonder it had months ago. Instead, it felt natural, inevitable, exactly as things should be. Margaret Hawthorne had finally learned to trust in her own worthiness for happiness, and that transformation had made all the difference. By mid-morning, the Hawthorne house had been transformed into a staging area for wedding preparations. Clara arrived early with Anna Richardson, both women armed with lists and a military-like efficiency that impressed even Ellen. The ceremony would take place in the grove behind the Morrison house, with the celebration continuing into the evening under lanterns strung between the trees. "Time for the transformation," Clara announced cheerfully as she helped Margaret into the ivory silk dress that had been carefully pressed and prepared. "Though I must say, sister dear, you hardly need transforming anymore." Margaret studied her reflection in the bedroom mirror, surprised by what she saw. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the self-deprecating girl who had hidden in shadows just months before. This was someone who stood straight, met her own gaze directly, and radiated the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly where she belonged. "You look beautiful," Anna said softly, arranging the simple veil that would complete Margaret's bridal ensemble. Truly, genuinely beautiful. The word no longer felt foreign or impossible. Margaret had learned that beauty came in many forms, and the kind that mattered most, the kind Daniel valued, had been hers all along. As they prepared to leave for the ceremony, Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression softer than Margaret had ever seen it. He was dressed in his finest clothes, his usually stern demeanor replaced by something approaching tenderness. "Margaret," he said quietly, You look like your grandmother did on her wedding day. She would have been proud to see you today." The comparison was precious beyond measure. Margaret's grandmother had been the one person in her childhood who had consistently shown her unconditional love and acceptance. To be compared to her on this day felt like receiving a blessing from beyond the grave. "Thank you, Papa," Margaret replied, meaning it completely. The short journey to Daniel's property took on the quality of a triumphant procession. Word of the wedding had spread throughout the county, and neighbors had lined the route to wave and call out congratulations. Children threw wildflower petals, and even Mrs. Patterson managed a smile that seemed almost genuine. At the Morrison house, Margaret could see that Daniel and his friends had transformed the grove into something magical. White ribbons fluttered from tree branches, and chairs arranged in neat rows faced an altar decorated with prairie flowers and greenery. The scene was simple but elegant, perfectly suited to the frontier setting while maintaining an air of celebration and joy. Daniel waited near the altar with Reverend Mitchell, and when Margaret first glimpsed him through the trees, her breath caught in her throat. He was dressed in a dark suit that emphasized his tall frame and weathered handsomeness, but it was his expression that stopped her heart. He was watching for her with the kind of anticipation that made it clear this was the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. As Thomas walked her down the makeshift aisle, Margaret was aware of the assembled community neighbors, friends, business associates, and family members who had gathered to witness this union. But the faces that mattered most were the ones showing genuine happiness for her success. Clara beaming with sisterly pride, Ellen dabbing at tears of joy, Jonathan grinning broadly, and Anna nodding with approval. Even more meaningful were the faces of people who had initially questioned Daniel's choice, but had come to understand and accept it. She saw farmers who had learned to value her practical knowledge, women who had observed her kindness and competence, and men who respected her intelligence and character. The community that had once seen her as Thomas Hawthorne's unmarriageable daughter now recognized her as a woman worthy of their most eligible bachelor, but none of that mattered as much as Daniel's face when Thomas placed her hand in his. The love and joy radiating from his expression made everything else fade into background noise. This was her moment, their moment, the beginning of the life they would build together. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Mitchell began, his voice carrying clearly in the prairie air, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Daniel Morrison and Margaret Hawthorne in holy matrimony." As the familiar words of the ceremony washed over her, Margaret found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had believed her father's harsh assessment that she was too ugly to marry. She had accepted that loneliness and service to others would define her entire existence. But Daniel Morrison had seen something different. He had looked past society's narrow definitions of beauty and value to recognize qualities that mattered more than surface appearances. His patient courtship had given her time to discover her own worth, and his unwavering consistency had taught her to trust in the reality of love. "Do you, Daniel Morrison, take Margaret Hawthorne to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Mitchell asked. "I do," Daniel replied, his voice strong and certain. "With all my heart." "Do you, Margaret Hawthorne, take Daniel Morrison to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd with perfect clarity. No hesitation, no doubt, no lingering fear that this was too good to be true. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Kansas, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Daniel, you may kiss your bride." Daniel's kiss was gentle but thorough, a public declaration of his love and commitment that left no room for doubt about his feelings. When they separated, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to echo across the entire prairie dot as they turned to face their community as husband and wife. Margaret felt a surge of emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her. These people, her people, were celebrating her happiness with genuine enthusiasm. The woman they had once pitied or dismissed was now being honored as the bride of one of their most respected citizens. The reception that followed was unlike anything Cedar Falls had seen in years. Tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by dozens of neighbors, and musicians had come from as far away as Dodge City to provide entertainment. Children ran between the adults, their laughter adding to the festive atmosphere, while couples of all ages took turns dancing on the wooden platform Daniel had constructed for the occasion. But for Margaret, the most meaningful moments came in the quiet conversations with individual guests who approached to offer personal congratulations. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Patterson said stiffly when she finally worked up the courage to approach the receiving line. "I may have spoken unkindly about your engagement in the past. It's clear that Mr. Morrison made an excellent choice." Margaret studied the older woman's face, seeing genuine discomfort and what might have been the beginning of real understanding. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I appreciate you saying that." It was a gracious response to what amounted to a backhanded compliment. But Margaret had learned that holding grudges served no useful purpose. Mrs. Patterson's inability to understand love based on character rather than appearance was her limitation, not Margaret's problem. As the afternoon melted into evening and the lanterns began casting warm pools of light among the trees, Margaret found herself dancing with her new husband while their community celebrated around them. The music was lively, the conversation animated, and the atmosphere filled with the kind of joy that marked truly significant occasions. "Happy?" Daniel asked as they swayed together to a gentle waltz. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Margaret replied honestly. 6 months ago, if someone had told me this day would come, I would have thought them completely delusional." Daniel chuckled. 6 months ago, If someone had told me I would find the perfect wife living just a few miles away, I might have said the same thing. Funny how life surprises us. Do you ever regret not choosing someone more conventional? Margaret asked, voicing the last lingering doubt she carried. Daniel stopped dancing and cupped her face in his hands, his expression completely serious. Margaret Morrison, you listen to me carefully. You are not my compromise or my second choice, or my practical decision. You are exactly the woman I hoped to find and never quite believed existed. Every quality I value most: intelligence, kindness, strength, integrity, genuine goodness, you possess in abundance. Any man who chooses a wife based solely on superficial appearance is a fool who doesn't understand what really matters in building a life together. The words washed over Margaret like warm sunlight, settling into the deepest corners of her heart where her father's cruel assessment had once lived. Daniel Morrison loved her not despite her plainness, but because he valued qualities that transcended conventional beauty. And after months of consistent demonstration, she finally believed him completely. As the evening wound toward its close, and guests began departing for their own homes, Margaret stood with Daniel on the porch of their house watching the last lanterns flicker among the trees. Tomorrow would bring the ordinary routines of married life, but tonight felt magical, suspended between her old existence and the future they would create together. Any second thoughts? Daniel asked with a smile that suggested he already knew. The answer: only that I wish I could write a letter to my younger self, Margaret replied. I would tell that sad, lonely girl that someday a good man would see her exactly as she was and love her for it. I would tell her to be patient, to believe in her own worth, and to trust that real love recognizes real value. What else would you tell her? Margaret considered the question carefully. That beauty isn't what other people see when they look at you, it's what the right person sees. That kindness matters more than prettiness, that intelligence matters more than fashion, and that a man who can't recognize those things isn't worth wanting anyway. Daniel pulled her closer, and Margaret marveled at how natural it felt to be held by someone who cherished her exactly as she was. No pretense, no apologies for her appearance, no grateful acceptance of whatever scraps of affection she could find. Just love, pure and simple and real. I have something to confess, Daniel said softly. That first day I saw you at Clara's wedding, watching you work so quietly and efficiently while everyone else focused on the celebration, I knew immediately that you were different from any woman I'd ever met. It wasn't charity or pity that made me approach you. It was recognition. Recognition of what? Of exactly what I'd been looking for without quite knowing it existed. A woman who understood the value of hard work, who cared more about substance than appearance, who had been tested by life and emerged with her goodness intact. You were never too ugly to marry, Margaret. You were too valuable for most men to recognize. As they prepared to enter their home as husband and wife, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary transformation her life had undergone. The woman who had once believed herself unworthy of love had become the cherished wife of a man who saw her as a prize worth winning. The daughter who had been told she was too plain to marry had found a husband who valued her mind, her character, and her heart above all else. Her father had been wrong about her prospects. Mrs. Patterson had been wrong about her worth. And most importantly, she had been wrong about herself. Margaret Morrison was exactly the woman Daniel wanted, exactly as she was, and that knowledge would sustain her through whatever challenges their future might bring. As they crossed the threshold of their new home together, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, not because she had settled for whatever she could get, but because she had finally learned to value herself enough to recognize genuine love when it was offered. And sometimes, she thought as Daniel's arms closed around her in the privacy of their own parlor, sometimes the best love stories were the ones that began not with love at first sight, but with the gradual recognition of qualities that mattered far more than surface beauty. Daniel Morrison had seen past society's narrow definitions to find a woman worth cherishing, and Margaret had learned to see herself through his eyes, worthy, valuable, and deeply, truly loved. The girl who had been told she was too ugly to marry had become a woman who understood that the right person would love her, not in spite of who she was, but because of it. And that understanding had made all the difference in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.